Hey there AOS fans, it's Pete here. No Robin today, you've got just me and my dulcet tones. I'm going to be running through with you a new little series that we've decided to call How to Play 40k. And this is quite simply going to be a little run through of how to play the game of 40k, coming from the assumption that you know absolutely nothing about the game or any previous versions of it. Now I'm going to try and do my best to try and say nothing along the lines of, well, in 6th edition you do this, but of course I may revert to type at some point, so please try and correct me if I start doing that. The 40k game has become a very simplified affair in the grand scheme of things and is very approachable for everybody, but it can still use a lot of terminology which might put some people off. So I'm going to run through with you each of the phases in the core rules and try and give you a little bit of a breakdown with some visual examples as to how things work. The first thing, and obviously one of the most important things, is the data sheets. Now these are something that you will need to play the game, and to get those you will either need to use the ones you get in the starter box, the Dark Imperium, or you'll have to buy one of the indexes that we've already done a little review of and that you'll see in the stores and online. Now the data sheet itself is a fairly simple affair as shown in the rulebook, and I'll just run through the basics really quick. So you have the name of the unit you have, in this case the Lord of Contagion. You then have their battlefield role type. Now we'll come on to this in a later episode, but that tells you what that unit is, whether it's a fast attack, a HQ or a troop choice, and various others. It then also has a power rating. Now this is a great little thing that GW have introduced, and it basically enables you to build an army of a certain power rating really quickly. The next thing you have is the profile, and the profile is broken down into a section of numbers, and each one has a particular value and use in the game. They are as follows. M stands for move, and that is how fast the unit can move, and that's measured in inches. The next one is WS, and that stands for weapon skill. This tells you pretty much how good they are in combat. If it's a dash, then they can't fight in melee or make close combat attacks. The next one is BS, and that stands for ballistic skill. This shows how good they are when shooting a weapon, and again, if it's a dash, they have no proficiency with ranged weapons and cannot make shooting attacks. S is for strength, and indicates how strong that model or the unit type is and how likely they are to inflict damage. The higher, the better. The next one is T, which stands for toughness, and that reflects how resilient the model is against being hit by someone with a high strength. The higher the toughness, the better. W stands for wounds, and that shows how many wounds a model can take before it gets removed from the tabletop when it gets killed. The next is A, stands for attacks, and this tells you how many attacks the model can make whilst fighting in hand-to-hand combat. We'll come to that later. The next is leadership, LD, and this reveals basically how courageous or self-determined that unit or model is to stay on the battlefield. And the last one is SV, and that stands for save, and that shows what kind of saving throw they have. The lower the better in this case. Now the next field you've got on here is the unit composition. The unit composition tells you what models are in that unit. It'll tell you how many there are. The next one after that is war gear, and that covers all the basic weapons and equipment that the models are armed with, and we'll come on to that in more detail later on. 7 shows you the abilities that unit has, because many units in the game have special abilities which may enable them to go against the grain of what the normal rules say or give them extras, and we'll come on to those as and when we need to. And the next section is the weapons. This lists all of the most common weapon types that unit can use, and weapons is again broken down into a section of sub-entries. You have the name of the weapon itself, the range of that weapon, melee means close combat only. You then have the type, and we'll come on to types later on, but there's a section of types. The next one is strength. Now again, that's just like the model strength, tells you how likely they are to wound somebody, and if it isn't an actual number, sometimes you might get a +2 or a ×2 instead, and that basically takes the user's strength, so in this case the Lord of Contagion strength of 4, and it adds 2 to it to make it 6. The next one is armor penetration. That tells you how much you have to take off of your save. The higher that number, or rather the higher the negative number, then the worse it makes your opponent save, the more likely it is to disregard their armor completely. And the last field is damage, and that tells you how much damage that weapon will cause if it scores an unsaved wound. After all these sections, there are 2 more sections at the bottom, one labelled faction keywords, which we'll come on to later, but they help you build your armies in matched play, and the next one is keywords, and that gives you a lot of other useful sections that you might need, but again we'll cover that later on when we get to that section in the rules. Now you may come onto statistics that say D6 or 2D6, and D6 is a reference to how many sides on the side of a dice. So if it says D6, you will take one standard 6-sided dice and you'll roll that when you need to determine that value, and you would roll that every time you need to determine that value. Okay, so those are the basics of the data sheet, and we're going to quickly run through some of the other things you're going to need to play a game. You are obviously going to need some models, painted preferably, but obviously beggars can't be choosers, so if you just put together your Dark Imperium models, then that's just as good. Generally, it's up to you and your opponent to decide what level of completeness you want your models to be. A lot of people don't mind if they're painted or not. Personally, I think a painted army looks best. The next thing you'll need is going to be a ruler. Now, you need a ruler, and this is the one that GW supply in the Dark Imperium's game, that measures inches. Now, it needs to measure in inches. The entire game is measured in inches. I could go into the reasons for this, and they're long and historic, but basically in the 70s when these games first came out, inches and feet were what we used. Not only this, you're going to need some dice. You don't need exactly a different 100 varieties of dice, but you will only need D6 for this game. I also think that a tape measure definitely is a requirement, because some of the things later on that you're going to need to measure are going to be a lot more than 12 inches. And so for that reason, a tape measure will be best. At some points in the game, like I said before, you will notice that it'll say you'll need D6. In that situation, you just take a dice like this, clear an area, obviously don't move any models in play, roll that dice, value pointing up is the value you've rolled. So in this case, 2. Sometimes you might say 2d6. In this case, you roll 2 dice and you add them together. 6. Still a bit below average, just my luck. I think I've got Robin's luck today. Now sometimes it might say D3, and you'd be sitting there thinking, well, how do I get a 3-sided dice? All you have to do in that situation is take one normal D6, you roll it, and halve it, rounding the value up. So 3 halves to 1.5, and then that rounds up to 2. 1 becomes half, which goes up to 1, 2 goes to 1, and so on, all the way up to 6, which halves to 3. And that gives you a D3 roll. Sometimes you'll be asked to modify a roll by a positive or negative number. In that situation, you would roll your dice or your die, and if you had a +1, that would then add 1 to this value and make it 3. Conversely, if you had rolled a 2 and you had to take away 1, it will reduce it down to 1. All modifiers are cumulative, so if you had to roll something and add +2 and also take away 2, you would pretty much end up at +0 and your original roll would stand. Another thing that's always worth covering at this stage is how to measure the movement of models. When your models are lined up on the tabletop, they will have a movement value. Now, if we assume these guys have a movement value of 6 to start with, you would place your measurer at the beginning, at the front of the model, and you would move it the full 6 to the end there. As you can see, he's moved 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 inches to there. This is assuming that this model has a 6-inch movement. You can also measure it from the rear of the model. So you would place it up to the back of the model like so, and then you would move it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 to there. And that's another 6 inches. What you don't do is you measure from front to back. So in this situation, if I measured front to back here, this model went from here to here, you can see that he's actually travelled a lot more than his 6 inches allows. Movement also applies to vehicles. And vehicles can move a certain distance. If we use this Rhino Predator, for example, and we say that it can move 6 inches, you measure from the hull 6 inches forwards, like so. Now again, with vehicles, they can only move as far as their maximum movement. This is a little harder with vehicles because they can be an odd shape. Whereas your average trooper is going to have a round base, so it's pretty easy to measure front to front or back to back. It doesn't matter which way he's facing at the end of it. That is pretty much okay. But with a vehicle, they can move a little bit strangely. So a vehicle may start here, and he may move his 6 inches forward to there, but then he may also decide to turn like so. Now that's okay, but the problem you have here is the rear of the vehicle, if we look where it starts here, is back here. And if I use this dice to just mark where that is, I move it 6 inches forward and turn the model, we can see that now this model has moved from here all the way over to there, and that movement at the back of the Rhino is 8 inches. That is not allowed. The vehicle can only move any part of it up to its maximum move. So if this were for 6 inches, it could only move up to there if it wanted to turn. And that can obviously have some repercussions that we'll see in a bit more detail later on. another thing we need to cover is coherency. Now, every unit in this game has to be set up within coherency, and that means that every model in that unit has to be within 2 inches of another model in that unit. In this case, these models here are nice and close together. These guys here are nice and close together. Coherency also works on a 6-inch assumption for height. So this guy is well within an inch here, and he's well within 6 inches up here. He could have a building pretty much all the way up to about here somewhere, way off the camera, and that would still be okay. What you can't do is you can't have a guy like this and a guy like this. These guys are well outside the 2-inch coherency, and that is not allowed. If, for example, you had a load of models like so, now this is fine because everybody is currently within 2 inches, but if during shooting some of them died and I took these two guys off for any particular reason, in my next movement phase I would have to make sure that these were all moved back within coherency, or else they cannot move at all. Another thing to bear in mind when using coherency is it only applies at the end of a model's movement. So whilst this model may move 6 inches all the way over to here, he's now out of 2 inches coherency, but that's fine because all that you need to do now is make sure that the rest of your models you move are all within 2 inches when they finish their movement, and that is now okay again because everybody is within 2 inches of each other. You don't have to worry about moving all your models one at a time, an inch a piece, to make sure they all stay within 2 inches. It's just at the end of their movement, making sure they all maintain coherency. So that's pretty much the basics, the beginnings of the 40k game. In the next episode, we're going to move on to the very first phase, which is the movement phase. And for that, all we're going to need is a few models, a couple of dice, and hopefully just our ruler.